Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are here with Thomas R. Weaver, author of Artificial Wisdom. As described in the opening, Artificial Wisdom is an enthralling techno thriller murder mystery that has grown near and dear to my heart at a rapid pace. Thomas, congratulations on your debut novel, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and thank you so much for having me on. I mean, the last few days in particular on TikTok and beyond have just been amazing. A lot of reception to the book, so I'm feeling like I've looked at a screen too much in the past 48 hours. I had to go
Oh,
for
I
a
feel
walk
that.
earlier just to get away from it all.
I hear you. I hear you. Yeah, I know. Was in on your interview with Kristen and Maddie. They're how I found out about this book, and I saw you guys were talking. I thought it was going to be for an hour, but I went to like a work meeting, came back, and you guys were still talking. I was like, "Dang, he's also got to talk to me tomorrow. He's going to be exhausted." But even
No
more
way,
so
I'm
appreciative.
I'm fresh.
I think where I wanted to start here was mostly just letting the audience and listeners get the opportunity to hear from you about your background and, where you're coming from going into the writing of this book and how it's informed this book. So I'd just love to open the floor there for you to kind of share some information like that with us.
Sure. Well, I suppose, the book is a techno thriller,
Hmm.
and my background probably plays a big role in that. Although I grew up reading fantasy, I'm a huge fantasy fan. What I spend my time thinking about is technology.
Hmm.
So for many years prior to writing this book, I had my own tech startup. It wasn't my first, but it may not even be my last. I thought it was my last. We
Yeah.
did actually sell. We sold it at the end of 2018, and I was
Hmm.
able to get out of it. Sometimes you're locked in for a long time. I was able to get out at the end of 2019, so just before the pandemic.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, I'm done. That's it. Like
That'll
this,
do.
this is me done. I can actually turn my attention to some of the things I've always dreamed of doing, which was writing. So that was
Absolutely.
the start of it. Really, it was having run a tech startup, having been a CEO, having spent a lot of time pitching to venture capitalists and
Hmm.
thinking about where technology is going, which is still of interest today. And despite the
Hmm.
fact I said I would never do that again, my former co-founder Chris, who I've worked with just for many many years, spent the next few years going, right, what are we doing next? What are we doing next? What are we doing next? Until I went, okay, let's do something. So we are still
We're
doing
doing something.
we're doing stuff. We are. We are.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And that's so interesting as far as the timeline of, your exit and how you got out of the company and how you started writing. When it comes to the timeline of the book itself, did that process start within the pandemic and the lockdown, or were you just writing in general?
Yeah, I kind of think I had the idea
Mm,
as I was finishing in 2019. I definitely had the idea. And maybe it had been bubbling away for a little bit, but I sort of said, okay, I think I could do this. But it turned out that when I finished work, and selling a company is about the most stressful thing I've ever experienced.
I can only
And
imagine.
if I ever show you a photo of what I looked like the day that I actually sold it, you wouldn't recognize me. It was 4 in the morning at a lawyer's office after a lot of whiskey, just trying to get through signing millions of pieces of paper and close the deal before Christmas. And if we hadn't closed the deal, the whole company would have failed. So, like, it was really down to the wire, and it burned me out. So when I finished, I didn't want to open a laptop anymore. The
Yeah.
idea of it made me feel physically sick. So I started to draw and to paint instead, and was having a wonderful time doing that, and doing urban sketching and getting out there and
Hey, that's
learning to
amazing.
draw stuff in real life. And then the pandemic hit, and I couldn't go outside anymore, and I didn't really want to pick up a pencil for drawing stuff in the house.
Mm.
So the laptop opened, and that was when it started.
And then it was all, I'd say, downhill from there, but for me, very uphill.
Yeah.
So that is awesome. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of us, especially artists, writers, creators, the pandemic had so many difficulties and so many trials and tribulations. But at the same time, there was just this wide open space where it's like, okay, everything, every excuse that I had for not doing that thing I said I was going to do, when all I needed was time. Now
Yeah.
I have time. And that time ended up being way longer than I think many of us anticipated. But for what it's worth, we got this wonderful novel out of it. And I'd love to hear just if you could tell us one thing that everyone needs to know either about you or about this book.
I think let's talk about the book. I think it's important for
Hmm.
people to know it is a blend of genres.
Hmm.
So I wanted to write something which is a little bit different, and I've certainly seen people say they haven't really read a book like it, which is good and bad, right? Because if you like books that follow a normal pattern, then you'll probably hate this. But if you're looking for something which is just a bit different, then this might be your thing. And when we say a blend, we're talking, as I say, it is a techno thriller, and by tech we mean
Hmm.
like high tech. Like it's trying to imagine what the landscape may look like in 2050. It's extrapolating that from today, but it also has a murder mystery at the heart of it,
It's
and
true.
that's very unusual for this kind of book. And as I say, that isn't going to appeal to everyone, but it was something I really wanted to write, and I think I have this attraction to stories that bake in the kind of stories that I enjoy watching on TV, things like The
Hmm.
Rookie
Yeah.
and things like Castle, police procedural kind of stuff, and then
Yeah.
Sherlock and that kind of thing. I have love for stories that bake that kind of narrative into fantasy or into sci-fi or into something different. Because so often we just
Absolutely.
get the same old kind of. We get a lot of adventure thrillers, in sci-fi,
Hmm.
a lot of heroes' journeys, but we don't get a lot of murders
Yeah,
of the
I
kind.
agree. I think that's a great point in that a lot of the sci-fi and fantasy I read isn't just based in like something like a murder mystery. It's usually some kind of large epic
Yeah,
or space opera. And I love how succinct this story not only employs the use of like sci-fi settings and like futuristic settings, but also that technology. It's just so impressive how you've been able to use those things that we love from some of our favorite genres like fantasy and sci-fi while still making it feel grounded in a real world story. And we'll talk a little bit more in the later segments about that not so futuristic future, and how that plays a part in it. But I agree that that is something that everybody should know for sure. So, going into the next segment, we'll start talking about the book, but I'd love to really talk about the process here. And so, I've got a few questions lined up in that regard. And so, people love hearing about inspiration, and I'm sure you've talked about the inspiration of this novel a ton. But if you could, one more time, just tell us a little bit about what inspired this novel, because it does feel so, this probably isn't even the right word for it, but prescient. It feels so urgent and it feels very relevant to not only where we are right now, but where we might be in the future in regards to technology, climate change, and even in regards to things like truth and information on a higher level. And so, what really inspired you to bring all of these themes together into this story, and what really compelled you to tell this story specifically?
yeah. Sometimes I think this writing for me was a bit of therapy, and
Hmm.
the other thing I discovered when I finished work, when I sold my business, and I suddenly had time that I hadn't really had for a long, long, long time, and time to think suddenly gets filled. I discovered very quickly with all of the things that you have to worry about that you just hadn't had time to worry about before now.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm a bit of a Twitter addict, or at least I was. Maybe less so nowadays. But I was a big Twitter addict, and I was
Same,
following
honestly.
things like the rise of the pandemic at the time and the rise of
Hmm.
disinformation around the pandemic. I was following, and had been for many years, the US election situation and the US political climate and the British one.
Hmm.
How we ended up exiting the European Union and how you
Hmm.
ended up with Donald Trump, and
Yeah,
and looking at the increased polarization on both sides. And
absolutely.
one of the things that really struck me was how easy it is to make very large groups of people believe something that isn't necessarily grounded in reality. And whether or not Russia influenced Brexit, whether they influenced the US election, I don't know whether we'll ever know 100% for sure. But
Hmm.
um, there's certainly indications that
Yeah.
they
There's
did,
at
right?
least
And that
cause for skepticism for
there's
sure.
skepticism, and it kind of just was occurring to me. It was going around in my head, like if they did, it was shockingly easy for them to do so. I mean, this was not
Hmm.
sophisticated at all. This was just a bunch of people sat in a room typing.
Hmm.
And if that's possible today, then I wanted to think, okay, what's it going to be like in 50 years when technology is just everywhere and is way more advanced than today and is connecting to us on a different level? Like, how easy is it going to be to persuade large groups of people to vote for or against their interests then? So that was
Hmm.
definitely one of the starting points. I was having a bit of a climate kind of crisis of my own. Like I was worrying about, my daughter's future and like, what are we going to do? And,
Hmm.
I think everybody goes through that surge of panic sometime, like when they get, when they suddenly
Absolutely.
go, oh my God, like, oh, and especially I think with the pandemic itself and seeing how badly people dealt with it
Hmm.
on all sorts of levels, but like just the kind of the need to bury everybody's head in the sand um,
Hmm.
suddenly made me go, my God, if we can't deal with this size problem, how do we deal with that sized problem?
Absolutely.
And it was very much a sense that we are going to leave things to the last minute. And if we leave things to the last minute, then the price you end up paying is really high. I mean, you do that all the time, right? You leave your work to the last minute, you can get it done, but you get it done at a much higher price than you would have done before. And I guess all this stuff was kind of coming together, and I was thinking, okay, there's disinformation and polarization and a new wave of propaganda and deep faking unlike anything we've ever
Hmm.
seen before, and the climate emergency, and denial and all this sort of stuff. And I just was this was my therapy. I had to get all of that out and say these are all the things I'm really worried about in society in our
Absolutely.
future. And sci-fi, if it can achieve one thing, it is the ability to turn the future into a narrative, to point to what the worst case scenario could be in these things, and to help you imagine it. And if you can
Hmm.
imagine it, then maybe you can do something about it now.
Absolutely. And I see it in your tagline oftentimes on the bios I've read for you, and that you write stories about tomorrow to help make sense of today. And
Yeah,
that just, I think, sums that up very well. And I think given that those are the inspirations for this story, I'm even more impressed at how compelling and entertaining this story is, because it could be very easy to have those things be the compelling motivators for a story and then turn it into a story that's just doom and gloom and
yeah,
spiraling for 400 pages. Whereas this, like those things, and I want to really lay this out for readers because my big one of my big influences here is not wanting to make readers feel like this is a nonfiction book they're reading about climate
yeah,
change. Like this is a very, very entertaining, fun story, to the point where you almost, until you really start asking yourself questions, you almost don't feel like it's a story about climate change or technology. And then you remember it kind of hits you somewhere in the middle towards the end. I was like, this is so much about what we're doing right now, but it doesn't feel, didactic or pedantic in any kind of way, or that it's telling people, hey, this is what you need to be doing right now. And
yeah,
so the fact that those are the motivators, and you're writing this book in a room sitting by yourself during the pandemic, and you're still able to tell a story that not only focuses on people and how they can interact and the decisions that they can make and the agency that the people have in the story, but it also does it in a way that doesn't feel like the end of the world and is actually a fun read. And those things are, I think, incredibly difficult to balance. So bravo to you on
thank you.
that one.
Yeah,
A few characters. Oh, go ahead.
it's not easy like that. So that absolutely sums up my ambition, that I
Hmm.
did not want to lecture to people. I did not
Hmm.
even want to present necessarily my point of view on it, although obviously there is a point of view. But I have characters in there with different point of views, and they might be right. I didn't want to present all answers because I don't have the answers. um, Most of all, I wanted people to just have a really fun reading experience, because honestly, that's why you're going to pick up a book. And
Absolutely.
I've read a number of other climate fiction books, and I'm not going to name which ones, but I read some that it was just like, it was just too heavy going, and I just couldn't. I just couldn't couldn't deal with it. So I
Hmm.
said, okay, I don't want my book to be like that. I don't want to write something else in this genre that just wears people down. I want people.
Absolutely.
This isn't a book. necessarily about hope, but it's a book that I hope leaves people with a sense of hope at the end.
Mhm. 'Cause at the very least, you don't want it to leave people with like paralysis and like, oh
No,
well, this
no.
book has made me feel like there's nothing I can do.
Yeah,
I left that book definitely feeling like, okay, like there are questions I need to be asking right now and things I
yeah.
need to be doing to make sure I have the best possible future for myself and future generations. When it comes to some characters, Marcus Tully, obviously one of our main protagonists here, let us in a little bit on the inspiration for that character, and kind of the goals that you have for that character in their journey through the story.
Yeah, so I think I was inspired to tell a an investigative journalism story, and I probably will put it back to All the President's Men.
Mm,
And just thinking about how important those guys were, Woodward, um, and Curry, and informing us and
mm.
uncovering this story. And I love that kind of genre of stuff. I mean, actually, I've watched a bunch of films on. If somebody puts one of those movies in front of me, The Post, or we
Oh,
watched
the
the one
post
about the
was
Boston
amazing.
Globe the other day. I forget what it's called, but I love that kind of genre. The
Absolutely.
investigative journalist has something interesting, and obviously you need a character who is going to be able to uncover stuff. And in this kind of story, that leaves you sometimes with, the beat weary detective, or
Hmm.
or somebody that happens to stumble into it, or a journalist. And I went with journalist because of All the President's Men, really to pay tribute to Bernstein and Woodward.
I see. I see. That's very interesting. Interesting. And when it comes to Marcus Tully, I feel like it was definitely the perfect kind of launching point for this story and the perfect driver for how we uncover things and his own personal journey through this. I think without giving away too much about the story itself, there does seem to be this balance between, am I fighting for vengeance or am I fighting for truth? And it seems very grayed in that area. And so, what was kind of the deciding factors on how Marcus Tully is going to go through this story?
So I think I wanted to create a character that was, I wouldn't say he's morally grey, but
Hmm.
he doesn't classically fit into somebody that always does things for in the right way. But he does have a
Hmm.
really good reason, and he is somebody that believes in the truth, and he believes that the truth should trump everything, even if the consequences of telling that truth are really high. Even if your story causes riots, even if people die because of your story,
Hmm.
he would argue that the truth is worth it, or at least at the beginning of the book. And
Hmm.
I wanted him to go on a journey of discovery around that kind of idea, and for it to be this recurring dilemma that he comes back to again and again and again. What is the cost of truth? Um, but of course, he's presented with a story which is really a conflict of interest. He's presented with a
Huge.
story that falls into his lap, which really he shouldn't be investigating. Like it's connected to his wife. He's not going to be rational about it. He's discovering it on the 10th anniversary of her death. It's a massive, massive, massive world changing story. He shouldn't be the one going after it, but he does. He does. So and I think those are the kind of thing that interests me in a character. I think if you, at least I figured out those bits really before I figured him out. Because if those bits tie in nicely, then the character can come out of it because you start to push them in a certain direction. You say, okay, what is this guy going to do in this situation?
Hmm.
So yeah, I liked him. He was a tough one to write. I'm going to be straight. Like Tully did not come off the page all in one go. Like for a while, I felt he was a bit bland, and I couldn't
Oh,
quite
I see.
understand him. Whereas some of my other characters, like Livia, for example, who's a second POV character, like I
Hmm.
knew who she was the moment I wrote her first words. I just got her. I could see her. Her words flew off the page. I knew her. It was
That's
unbelievable.
awesome. That's
Tully, no,
surprising.
took ages. Took
Wow.
ages with Tully, and I was really like, who is this guy? Like, I understand what makes him tick, but he was he just took time. But then I got him, and
Hmm.
and people
Absolutely.
like him. I think he's a different character.
Yeah, I mean, I love Tully. I was rooting for him the whole time, and it got to the point where I had to recognize that I was falling into the same kind of biases that he was. Like, I feel like I was taking on his grief and being like, no, Tully's doing the right thing for the right people. But
Mm.
people, as the story goes on and people keep questioning and questioning, like, okay, Tully, are you really doing this because you think this is the right thing to do? Or is this like
Yeah.
a vengeance plot for your family?
Yeah.
And I was like, dang, I think I might be falling for that same
I,
trap.
I like that because you know what you're trying to do as a writer
Mm,
is, especially nowadays, the way that fiction has evolved has moved from the Dickensian external narrator who's
mm,
narrating from 1,000 feet up, and they're able to see into everybody's heads, but not too much. But they're really almost the character in their own right. And the
mm.
trend now is much more cinematic. You are inside that character's head looking out. You are trying to color the page with their perspective and their point of view. And what you're trying to do by that is actually to leave the reader believing the same things they do. And
Yeah.
it's been done brilliantly. And sometimes it's done brilliantly on film. It's much harder, but you have unreliable narrators all over the place. I don't think Tully is unreliable, or any of my guys are unreliable. What I wanted to try and achieve was just a thing where you were inside their head enough that you
Mm.
you saw the world as they did.
Absolutely. And I'd say that really with these characters, they are not the end all be all for the moral line of the story. And I
No,
think that's super important that they're not like unreliable, but they do come with their flaws and their flaws do inform a line of thinking.
yeah,
And I thought that is something I could really appreciate. You mentioned Olivia, and I wanted to talk about not only Olivia, but Martha as well. The sisters, I thought it was so interesting that both of them represent kind of two different roles and worlds you might live in when it comes to the tech world. Olivia, the coder, eating Cheetos, like, drinking day old coffee in her boss's apartment. Martha, Silicon Valley, wearing a suit, lives in a mansion, has this type of lifestyle. And those are two opposite ends of the spectrum, but really two layers of a cake when it comes to the tech world. And obviously, knowing that you come from that world, what was the intention behind having these two sisters both come from the tech world and kind of represent two different faces of that world?
I think it's a great observation. I see these things as being connected because I've known people
Mm-hmm.
go from one of those to the other,
Mm-hmm.
and
Absolutely.
sometimes that can happen incredibly quickly. And often, sometimes there's a difference. Like I've known people that have exited their businesses, and then they just continue as they were, wearing shorts and eating Cheetos and drinking. But if you're running a large business, if you're suddenly, and this is what I never wanted to do as a startup founder, by the way, but I never wanted to get to the stage where I had to attend earnings calls. That just
Yeah.
sounded like the worst thing in the world to me. So, but
No,
like, what
thank
do you
you.
do? Well, you have to step up. So you've gone from coding something, running a small team of engineers and locked away in a basement, and then your product takes light, and then suddenly you're talking to a load of financial analysts from Goldman Sachs on the phone, and you've got to do that credibly, and that's just startup life. So these sisters, they started in the same place. They have, I think a really fun relationship. I just think it's a
Yeah.
great kind of sibling kind of relationship where they love each
Hmm.
other, but they frustrate the hell out of each other. Um,
Absolutely.
and where one of them has been incredibly successful and the other one hasn't. And so that colors both of them as to how they
Hmm.
view each other. And yet they are both much more alike than they would otherwise believe.
Absolutely. And I thought that was another very interesting part of it, not only the tech part of it, but the sister part of it. And I'd love to talk a little bit about family when it comes to this story. These two are sisters, and I do love how there is kind of, what's the word for it? There is a bottom line, at least, of respect for each other, even in their disagreements, even in their difference in status. Like Martha's conversations with Olivia, obviously, there are some frustrations there. There's, a little bit of pretension, but at the same time, there is like this overarching love and care and concern for her sister. And even Olivia has, this desires to this feeling of inadequacy these things that she's dealing with, but at the same time, she wants to make her sister proud. She wants to represent their family very well. I would love to hear just kind of where you found the inspiration and where you found the well of information to write Sisters so compelling in this way that it feels very nuanced and realistic. Like, is there family members that this is like tied into, or do you have siblings yourself?
I do have a sibling myself. My
Hmm.
relationship's very different. I
Hmm.
love my brother to bits. He's 9 years older than me.
Hmm.
We're part of different generations. Like he moved away from home when he was 18, and got married very
Hmm.
soon after. And we've lived very different lives, but we're we're friends. Like we talk often, but it's just very different. But I do have two daughters.
Mm.
Maybe that was on my mind.
Oh,
They're
I see.
young, so they don't have the kind of baggage and relationship that Martha and Livia do. But I do think it's interesting watching two girls learn how to deal with each other, and
Absolutely.
especially now they're entering. They weren't at the time, but now they're entering their teenage years. So it's
Hmm.
fascinating. It's kind of it's great to see just that it's a learning experience. I think having a sibling is all partly about preparing you for dealing with more complicated relationships in your life because
Hmm.
you can't escape them. You're locked in the same family unit as them. You can't ditch them like you would a troublesome
Yeah,
friend, and you just have to learn how to navigate that on your own. So yeah, I don't know whether they were directly inspired, but certainly,
absolutely.
maybe looking back on it, maybe the fact they have two girls did play a big part.
Yeah, and I think at the very least, I do feel like it shows how these sisters can love each other. Like, I think it really takes someone who either has siblings or has that experience of you just love this person like unconditionally, like no
Yeah.
matter what they go through, regardless of where the status of the relationship is. Like that love just shines through, and it felt very compelling with these two sisters. I'd love to step into some conversations about a few literary choices here. You mentioned obviously that this doesn't have necessarily an all seeing narrator in the story, but we do get multiple perspectives that we kind of get to go inward on. And was that always the case when it came to the drafts of this story? I know we mostly follow Tully October and Olivia, but were there any other perspectives you considered writing the stories through? And was there ever a point where the story was just told through one lens?
Yeah, interesting. I think originally I also wrote a chapter in Martha's perspective, so
Ooh.
Olivia's sister, which
Hmm.
I have around somewhere. It's not very polished because it got taken out pretty early.
I see.
But I guess this is one of the challenges of growing up as a fantasy reader, is that
Hmm.
if you're used to reading The Wheel of Time, you've been
Hmm.
used to a world in which you see 700 unique POVs on
It's
this
true.
universe, right? And so when you're starting to write and you're like, hey, yeah, let's throw all of the POVs in. And then, I have a writing coach. I took a writing coach from the beginning, and he's
Oh,
brilliant
awesome.
and he's now become one of my best friends. And I probably talk more to him on WhatsApp than any other person. Like we're always
That's
exchanging
amazing.
ideas and notes, and I'm alpha reading his book right now, and it's awesome. He's a published author himself, and he did push me to try and reduce the amount of POVs. Um,
Hmm.
and right from the beginning, he said, "Look, it's going to be complicated." If I was offering advice to younger Tom writing this story, like I think it's much more done that in your debut novel, you try and stick to one, and
Hmm.
and funnily enough, in my second book, I've gone for one main POV, and then I just occasionally drop in like when I need to, I'll drop in like one
Hmm.
scene from the POV of like somebody else,
Oh,
but
wow.
I've gone
Wow.
for one main, and it is different. It takes you on a much more different ride. But with a murder mystery, I felt it was important to be able to show because I wanted people to be deeply in one character's head because I didn't
Hmm.
want a narrator that could see everything. Um, if you only have one character, then the world closes in around them. And you
Hmm.
don't necessarily get to experience that beautiful tension when one character knows something and the other character knows something else, and they haven't quite yet put those things together. So you're slightly ahead of them both. Like I
Hmm.
like that kind of tension.
It's
I
true.
don't do the whole, we're not talking to each other trope like much.
The
Maybe some
miscommunication
bits, but
trope
yeah,
is, yeah,
miscommunication. Don't like
some
any
of
of
my
that.
least favorites.
But at least I do think that the idea that people are on their own independent journeys and discovering things at different rates, and especially this is a book that has a bunch of twists in. And
Hmm.
so then I sometimes want the reader to get a twist, but the character doesn't know the twist. I think that's fun. Like I have a
No,
good ride with that one because
it
you,
was so fun to read, that's for sure. Because
yeah,
when Olivia was starting to figure, or when Tully was starting to figure things out that he hadn't shared with Olivia yet, I was
yeah,
like running around my room, like they need to, it's
they
like
need
she's gonna
to,
do something crazy.
yeah.
It was really awesome, and I'd love to even tap into that a little bit. When it's all said and done, I think what people will find most exciting about this book is its impeccable pace and the constant tension that builds throughout the story. As murder mysteries and thrillers are concerned, this book enters what I feel is an upper echelon of like mind-altering twists. For someone writing their first novel, where do you feel like this skill comes from as far as how you learned how to build this pacing and this tension, and how did you manage to pull off a story that keeps people on their toes the way this one does from pretty much page one to the very end?
Well, I think the twists. I don't know if anybody can really learn it. Like
Hmm.
there's books out there on writing mystery, and I listened to all of it, and I listened to all the podcasts I possibly could do, and I
Yeah.
inhaled just as much stuff as I possibly could do on writing. Um, but ultimately, it's down to you to figure out your story. And I had just been reading as I started to plot this an Agatha Christie book, and
Mm.
I'd read a few before, and I'd always really enjoyed them. But this particular one was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is incredible, and it has a great like. So I sat down with a notebook. Like I sat down with like. In fact, I think it's possibly even this book, but like I sat
Oh,
down with
wow.
this book and I was like, I'm gonna crack this one. I know that people don't often crack this one. I'm gonna be the one. I'm gonna sit there and I'm gonna figure it out before the end. I'm gonna know. And I wrote down notes the whole way through, and I was really looking through to see like breadcrumbs and figure it out. And damn it, she still got me. I was still completely wrong. I was like,
I feel the
oh,
same way about this one. I was like, I've got all the pieces. Like, if you could
got all
imagine
the
in your
pieces.
head a person with like a map on the wall, and
Yeah,
like with
the
all the
crazy
little red
person with
dots
the
and
red light.
string, I'm just
Yeah,
like, I know I can figure this out. And
yeah.
at the end, I was still cooked. So,
Yeah. And what Christy does brilliantly is she when you land on that twist, you don't go, oh, like that, that's come out of nowhere. If you
hmm.
look back, you're like, oh, I can now just start to piece together all the bits. Like it
Hmm.
makes sense. And that was
Absolutely.
like kind of mind blowing to me. And so I was quite inspired by that. I thought that would be really fun. But obviously, Christie was writing in an age where there was a bunch of people without any technology in a closed environment, which was usually like a country house
Hmm.
or a little village, and
Oh, yeah.
and technology complicates these things immensely because you have tracking and you have cameras and you have and that kind of made me interested as well. I know that a lot of writers found it difficult to write thrillers after the advent of the mobile phone because after the advent of the mobile phone, suddenly everything changed.
Texting and
And you
internet,
couldn't do
really.
that thing where somebody didn't have what was out of communication anymore. And so I wanted to go the opposite way and go, what if we just have crazy amounts of technology? Like, what then? So,
Hmm.
like, what if your evidence gets cleaned up by the automatic cleaning bots? Like, what happens then?
No, that was awesome. Yeah, I was like,
It's just,
wow, this is like actually it feels not only more difficult to get away with a murder in this book, which makes it even more impressive and even more convoluted, but it also becomes more difficult to, solve that murder because as technologies rise to help solve murders, technologies also rise to help hide them. Like
yeah,
we get better at
yeah,
those things, which is
yeah,
scary, but very impressive. One thing we've somehow managed to not talk about in the 34 minutes we've been talking here is that an artificial intelligence program is running for a global dictator of the world.
yes,
Um, but has also already successfully governed a group of islands for a considerable amount of time. What I'm most impressed by here is how compelling of a character Solomon is. I think some of the best fictional AI characters have always had a depth to them that is difficult to source. But could you walk me through the process of how Solomon came to fruition in this story and what your desired impression was for the reader?
yeah. So AI is critical to this, but I didn't want to tell the
Hmm.
same old AI story that had already been
Yeah.
told. And I think um, there's some nice little Easter eggs for fans of 2001: Space Odyssey, which obviously
Mm.
features a very famous AI, Hal, who won't let Dave back in through the pod door. There's a couple of kind of hidden references to that throughout the book, one not so hidden reference, but this idea of malevolent AI or the Terminator or the machines in the Matrix, it's been done, and
Hmm.
and unfortunately, I think actually it's been done in a way that it's actually shaped our narrative, our social
Hmm.
narrative about how we think about technology. We view it
Absolutely.
as we would, like if we were suddenly becoming a dominant species, and we are the dominant species, but if we were suddenly, if we weren't the dominant species and we became one, we would probably stamp out whatever we'd just overtaken, because that's just humanity, and humanity is building this technology. I wanted to tell something different, but
Yeah.
I do think it is inevitable in a way that we will anthropomorphize the technology. Like we even
Hmm.
now, I mean, look at what happened the last week as we film. But OpenAI released their newest technology that you could talk to, and they used the voice of they used a voice that was very similar to Scarlett Johansson in Her.
Oh, I saw
Um,
bits about that.
yeah, and so everybody was freaking out because, well, you've just taken somebody's voice. But I thought what was more interesting was the effort they'd gone to make it sound human. And of
Hmm.
course, you're going to do that because it's just in our nature. We anthropomorphize, I can't even say the word, but we do that to our pets, right?
It's
We,
true.
we ascribe human emotion to our pets, even though we know that that's probably not what they're feeling, but we like that. That's just what we do. We do it to
We do
objects
that
as
to
well.
like grass and trees and like our
Yeah.
cars, and so
So,
very
so
prevalent.
we make it human, but we also know that technology has the capability of doing things that previously we would have said was really in the territory of great religions.
Hmm.
If technology could speak individually to every person on the planet at the same time in parallel, is that not omnipresence? Like in the way
Yeah.
that we would have thought about it, and I'm treading my words carefully here because I don't want to offend anybody that's religious, and certainly I had no intention of that within the book. But I do think that we are close to inventing things that have powers that could have, if you take it back in time, would have been seen as religious. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if I were to take my Amazon Alexa back to the year like 500 BC, I mean, they'd probably stone me with rocks. But before
Yeah,
that, they would think that God was speaking through that little device there. And
yeah,
so if I took my iPhone back to like the 1800s, they would crown me the next king
that's right.
or the Pope. And so that's a great point. And I think that is prevalent in the story in that there are sections of skepticism that do come from a religious like standpoint of this feels wrong because it feels like
Yeah,
whether that's the intention or not, it feels like we're trying to replace, religion, these figures in our lives with this technology. When really, it's like this is just the development of not only humankind but technology is just going to go in this direction where we're going to be able to do these things that we thought only possible by some sentient being.
yeah.
And I just thought that was so cool. But I wanted to ask you, from a personal standpoint, would you elect an AI to run your country?
Right. Have you seen the British leadership right now? I mean, couldn't go far worse, could we? That's what I think was interesting. I probably am very disillusioned with politicians.
Hmm.
Who's the last
I'd say
decent
I'm the
politician
same.
I remember? I mean, it was probably Obama, right? Uh, I, God, I mean, it's just desperate. We just have a desperate lack of incredible leadership, and they just
Hmm.
seem to be getting worse and worse and worse. Maybe I'm just getting old. I don't know, but um, so again, I didn't want to paint something where you're an absolute yes or no on
Hmm.
this. I wanted readers to argue with each other over it, like
Absolutely.
and disagree.
Hmm.
But I've definitely had a lot of people in the book going, yes, I 100% would prefer this to what we have today. And I've definitely had people in the book saying, absolutely no way, this is the most scary thing I've ever read, and I would never want an AI near my political ambition, keys, or indeed the nuclear codes. So
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's typically where I fall. I think for me, it's probably something I would be able to entertain on a small scale. Like, I like that it starts off that Solomon is running these islands as governor, and like very small scale. The decisions between who and when and why to help people is very like limited to a small population. But when you start thinking about things, especially on the scale of here in the U.S., like having someone run our country, which is essentially 50 countries put together,
Yeah,
and trying to balance the scales between New York and Wisconsin, it's just like
yeah.
I would be scared to put that in the hands of an artificial intelligence. But
It's
it definitely
interesting,
raised
isn't it?
those
It's interesting,
questions.
isn't it? Because you have to then ask yourself the question: why am I not scared to put it in the hands of a human being?
It's true. It's true. It's like it feels like it makes me feel like the options just aren't great, or maybe
Yeah,
we shouldn't just have one person running this large of a country. But that has been
but and by the way,
something that's on
so
my mind.
and it's on my mind a lot.
Mhm.
I deliberately chose a very provocative word in this, which is dictator.
Yes.
And that was an interesting one that we flip-flopped on during the process. And I had one editor in particular who really hated it, and they were like, look, this is gonna get in people's way, like it's going to trip them
Mhm.
up, because dictator is such a negative word. But the origins of the word were not negative at all. The
Mhm.
origins, if you go back to ancient Rome, these were people that were appointed by the governing body, the Senate, to essentially get Rome out of a crisis. When the Carthaginians came over the Alps, they appointed a dictator, and the dictator would have complete command until they'd solved the problem, and then they would hand power back. And
Mhm.
you had some pretty hardcore dictators, people like Sulla, who did launch a civil war during the process, but at the end of the day did hand power back. And then you had Caesar, who didn't hand power back, and they killed him for it. So he was the last
Yeah.
dictator, and it's because of Caesar a little bit. And I'm a massive Caesar fan, but it's because of him that we view the word as then evolved into something which is
Absolutely.
negative.
Yeah, and I
Um,
thought
but
that was I was really thankful that you kind of put that in the book as far as that conversation that they have regarding that whole situation because the whole book I was like, I don't love it.
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
like in
And I
general, I'd
don't
love
think
if
you
we
should
weren't
love it.
having this.
I don't think you
Yeah,
should love it, but I just think it was more interesting. I like provoking, so if it was
hmm
interesting not to
very
have like
provocative.
global president, because global
Hmm
president still implies ultimately that
Yeah.
it's kind of like a elected position with a weak mandate, and I liked the urgency of dictator and this idea
hmm
that they had this mission and this mandate, and
Yeah,
then they had to hand power back at the end of it. In
and it
theory, and
does.
of course, that's a question mark for everybody.
Mhm,
Will whoever wins this position, would they hand power back if you were in that position? It's a
absolutely.
gamble.
And I think the subtext of the even the title, salvation has a price. Like that is such a great example of that. It's like, okay, this feels actually, when you think about it, something that would help if we were all on the same page trying to save the world.
Yeah,
But that does come at the price of trusting one person with this kind of dominion, which is very, very interesting. And I do think the book does a great job of being provocative in a way that isn't just for the sake of being provocative, but for the sake of introducing some questions that need a lot of thought put towards them. One phrase that pops up in the book a lot is that's the thing about truth. It's a phrase that's often used throughout the novel. How did the idea of truth come to take a center stage in this book? And what was the idea you hoped to get across by bringing it to front of mind so often?
I think early on I decided that as I was studying the craft of
Mm-hmm.
screenwriting, actually more than novel writing, there's some great screenwriters who talk about the importance of dilemma in a story,
Mm-hmm.
and having a really strong sense of dilemma means that you get to paint the entire narrative as a tug of war. And so for me, my core dilemma was truth versus consequence. And I
Mm.
wanted to really, for Tully, for him to be grappling with that endlessly through the story. And so it was natural to me that truth became important to him. I also, interestingly, and actually it seems so long ago now, I almost forgot this, but I had a brief chat with somebody who was actually a character psychologist.
Hmm.
can't remember her name, but she was fantastic. We right at the beginning of this, right at the beginning as I was starting to write, and I was trying to figure Tully out. I found her online and I contacted her, and she read my early stuff and she read my character portraits, and we had a great like 1 hour consultation. And she said like, maybe dial this up, make him a zealot, you know,
Mm,
and it gives it something just stronger to hang on. So I think there was that idea. There is his, this recurring theme. He does say these words a lot. That's the thing about truth, but it's a different thing after every time.
mm,
And that actually came very late in the book that I put those in. All of the sentences underneath that were there, but I turned it into this kind of mantra. Um,
mm.
and I
I
think
loved
that
it.
was
I thought it was so effective.
Thank you. It's not for everyone. And again, so my co-founder, when he read the book, it was like, that really annoyed me, like that you used it again and again and again. It doesn't work for everyone, but I think it was partly inspired when I secured Stephen Pacey, the narrator, as my narrator. He was my number one
Mm,
choice. He's the narrator of the First Law trilogy.
big
And I've
fan.
been listening to the First Law trilogy a lot in preparation for trying to pitch to him. And one thing that Joe Abercrombie does very well is he uses these recurring phrases for people like Logan Nine Fingers, and they work really, really well in just kind of
Hmm.
reestablishing what he believes in. So I liked that idea, but I wanted one that wasn't going to be the same every time.
Hmm.
I think for somebody like Logan Nine Fingers, it's still alive, and he
Hmm.
will repeat that to himself, and he's got a few other ones.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But
No.
like for me, it was something where that's the thing about truth, but like it was a different answer every time, which in itself is a contradiction because that's not then the one thing about truth. So it just yeah, I just kind of loved how wrong it was.
Yeah.
Um, for him to use that again and again and again, but
And
it
that's why I
it
thought
hit
the
every time.
repetition was, yeah, that's why I thought the repetition was so effective because after a while you're like, I think this guy might just be clinging on to something that might not really have a lot of substance to it.
Yeah,
And so, it honestly, the more he says it, maybe the more he feels vindicated, but the more he says it as a reader, the more doubt I started to feel towards
yeah.
the whole scenario. So, I thought it definitely had an effective part in the book for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely that element of Tully where because you're seeing the world through his lens, you believe he's like
Mm,
he's the master at the top of his game and he's in control and he's one with the people, is down there watching stuff going on with everything else. But I remember there was one editor I used. I worked with a few editors mainly to get
mm,
different opinions. So I worked with my writing coach and editor the whole way through, Mark, who's brilliant. But occasionally I did use some other people just to because we were so close to the story, just to try and see whether
mm,
things work. And one I worked with very early on, Bryony, who's a wonderful YA author. She was looking at these early chapters, and there was a bit where she's like, I remember she'd written on the page like, "Gosh, Tully's really looking down on everybody from like an ivory tower," and then in the very next scene, Tully is accused of exactly that by
yeah.
this right wing commentator. Tully's accused of looking down on everybody an ivory tower, and she's like, "Yes, exactly. I feel like the same thing." Um, but yeah, again, I just think that's the fun things you can do with the character that isn't just the classic kind of guy who's got it all right and got it all figured out.
Mm. Yeah, those are. I always am. That's probably a flaw in myself, but I'm always looking for the flaws in the main characters that I'm reading because I feel like I can attach to those more than I can their ideals at times, or I am always looking to see if their ideals are going to be tested. And I think Tully's is definitely tested through and through here. I think those are most of the questions I had about the book itself at this point in time. I did want to talk a little bit about the audiobook experience. I think I may be unique in that I've actually only listened to the book via audiobook. And so the
Wow.
entire way. Usually I try to do both, but I hadn't honestly had listened to the book so fast that I hadn't had time to get a physical copy of the book.
It's not even
And
come out
so,
yet in the US. It comes out next week in hardback in the US. So
oh yeah, and
yeah,
so yeah, just waiting on that, and I just listened to the whole thing, and it was
great.
enthralling. Stephen Pacey, definitely one of my favorite audiobook narrators. I love the First Law trilogy,
Yeah.
and he does an incredible job there. What was that experience like bringing him on board? I know it probably involved a pitch, especially here for like your first novel. Could you walk me through that process and what it was like working with him?
Yeah. So, as I say, he was my first and only choice. I mean,
Hmm.
my father and my mother are the big audiobook listeners, so they were like sending me suggestions and so on. And I was like, yeah, these are all good, but they're not Stephen Pacey, right? Um, and I was thinking, oh, he's never going to work with me. Like, I look, at the books he's done, and he's obviously aside from Joe, who's amazing, he's also represented just some other incredible authors.
Hmm.
Fred Forsyth, and I think he did like James Herbert, the horror writer, like a
Hmm.
bunch of really
Yeah.
incredible kind of stuff. And I was like, there's just no way. And yet, that's never really stopped me doing anything. One thing you learn when you are running a startup is how to pitch and just go for the biggest thing, and not
Absolutely.
not kind of view the fact that you're a small startup holding you back. I mean, we were pitching to people like Apple and Facebook and um, Amazon and stuff at the highest levels. And we
Yeah.
managed to get in the room as a startup and meet with these people. So, I'd had experience of that, but I wanted to do it right. So I found his agents online, and I'd found them, and they said, well, yeah, send us a first chapter, I think was what they
Hmm.
said, and a list of character names, I think was the other thing they asked for. And I kind of went away, and actually I didn't get back to them for like 3 months because I was thinking about it, going, if I'm going to do this, I need to do it well. So I really made sure the novel was as sharp as it could be. I was really going
Hmm.
through thinking, if he's just going to read those first few chapters, it has to be amazing. But I also put together this pitch document, and rather than just sending a list of characters, I generated portraits of these characters using
Mm.
Midjourney, like really good
Nice.
ones, cinematic portraits of these characters to help visualize them. And I wrote like character notes on every single main character, and then all the secondary characters, and then listed all of the other ones and all of the information I had on them, what accent they might have, and some quotes from them, and I wrote him a letter during it as well, to saying like, why did I want to work with him? Because I always think
Mm.
that's important. You've got to say
Yeah.
like, I haven't just sent this round to a whole bunch of people. I'm sending it to you, and you are the best person in the world to read this because, right? And I
Yeah.
pointed out to him. I said, look, there was a moment that made me realize. Um, you were the best guy in the business. And it was listening to the blade itself, and it was listening to Glockter's monologue.
Oh wow. Yeah.
And when you listen to Inquisitor Glockter and the blade itself, Glockter's had a bunch of teeth removed, right? So
Hmm.
he speaks with a lisp, and Stephen does a great job with the lisp. When you move inside Glockter's head, that lisp is gone.
Yeah.
And that moment
It's
that you,
phenomenal.
as a listener, realize, and maybe not everybody realizes it, but when I realized that, I was like, holy, this guy is like on
This guy's a
another
real
level.
deal.
Like, this is technical ability beyond anything. So I told him
Absolutely.
that. I said, look, this is one of the core reasons I think that you're just outstanding. I listen, I read my own book with you in my head.
Hmm.
Like, I've heard you narrate my book.
High
Um,
praise. Well
and
deserved.
and I really didn't think he would say yes, but you've got to pitch these things. You've got to just believe it.
Oh yeah.
And he did. He did say yes. And I remember, I can literally remember where I was when I got the email through, and it was definitely up there in top happy days in my
Mm.
life.
That's
And then I got
amazing.
to meet him.
Oh
So,
yeah.
so first of all, you send the manuscript, right? You send the manuscript, and because he has to go through the whole thing. So we agreed terms. I agreed terms with his agents, and I got in touch with him, and he said some nice stuff about the early stuff, and I sent him a copy of the manuscript, and he read it for like 10 days. And during the
Wow.
process, it was pretty interesting. So he would like send me occasional emails, or eventually we connected more over iMessage as well. And it would just be character questions like, hey, I thought this guy, Bolivar, I had him as New York, but I've just reached a stage of the book where he says the word bloody, and now I'm thinking he's more British. And, let's talk about him.
Hmm.
And I'd said to him from the beginning, I am not going to tell you what accent to use on anyone because you are the best person in this space at this, and I'm a novice who's never done this before. So, like, I'm not going to tell you like this is what you should do. I'm just going to tell you, like, if there's anything specific I have said in the book. Like, I
Hmm.
define Solomon's accent in the book as being a little bit like an Orson Welles type Hollywood old actor,
That's what it felt like for
right?
sure.
And so he would take those things on board. But if I didn't define it, then he was free to do whatever he wanted. Um, so we were chatting backwards forward through the book, and then we were due to I don't know whether we were due to record. It got cancelled. We were due to meet on the day of the recording, and the recording studio had a problem with their computers, and it all got pushed back several weeks. And we decided to meet anyway. So I drove down. He lives about an hour and a half south of me. He drove up from where he was a little bit. We met in a little village, kind of halfway in between, and we found a pub that was empty. And we sat
Nice.
there and we had a beer together, and we went through all of his questions. And it was just brilliant because, first of all, he was by far the best proofreader like I had. And I'd had a bunch of
Really?
proofreaders up to that point and editors, and loads of people had read the book. He still picked up things that everybody else had missed. It was unbelievable. His level, because he had
Wow.
to read it aloud,
Hmm.
he spotted stuff. He was, in fact, I was even writing today, like even in the first paragraph, I changed a word because of him, because we were talking about how it was going to sound. And there was one word that ended up changing
Hmm.
from glistened to glinted, and it was, and purely because we were just talking about the rhythm of the thing, right?
Hmm.
So that was the kind of level of conversation we got into, and he loved the book. It
Wow.
was great. He loved the book. He was excited about it. He'd enjoyed it. He'd found himself getting into it. By the end of reading it the second time in the studios, with the producer there, he was, he'd really enjoyed the experience as well. So it was great. I mean, it's honestly what a privilege in my life to be able to work with somebody like Stephen Pacey, and I'm still in touch with him now. I'm sending him TikToks when somebody does something
Excellent.
awesome, and then
Yeah,
he
I need to
mentions
I
him.
need
I
to do
send
my
it through.
stitch. Absolutely. Yeah, he's incredible. So excited. And you talked about that feeling when you received that he was going to be doing it. And I wanted to talk a little bit more now about kind of the reception, the aftermath of publishing this book. So, can you share with me just how it felt to finally have completed your first novel and maybe even walk us through those moments when you first held the first copy in your hand?
Hmm. Well, I kind of spoiled it a little bit for me because I was printing it along the way. Like
Oh,
I
I
was
see.
using lulu.com, and I was doing like
Mm.
I mean, I've got like, this is a crazy early draft. This is like draft 5, so it looks completely different.
Oh, wow.
Even the opening is different. I mean, the opening line is 7 bodies lay strewn across the scorched street. I'm not sure Stephen could have read that. Um, so I was kind of printing it out and handing it around to people as I went. But it was still an awesome thing, like especially when I got to
Mhm.
hold the actual hardback, and to go, okay, this is real. This is something I've done. It's
Yeah.
very, very cool. Um, I've never been good at celebration. My head
Mm.
always moves on to the next thing. It's like, okay, right, now it's got it written. Now I've got to
Very
find people to read
similar.
it, right? So you're already kind of moving on in your head. And look, I independently published this. I
Mhm.
wanted it to have the feel and quality and experience of reading a traditional book. Because the reasons I independently published wasn't to do this to bypass gatekeepers. It was because I
Mhm.
didn't believe that the traditional publishing industry would put marketing money behind it. And I think
Mm.
there's so many amazing books out there that just don't get read. And I look at
It's
some of the
true.
traditionally published authors I know, friends of friends or friends directly now, who have traditional publishing contracts, and nobody reads their books because there's just no marketing money and there's no marketing capacity, and I just don't want to have that experience. And I thought,
Yeah.
well, at least I can make sure that it's done beautifully. Like the cover is professional, it has a great quality feel to it. It's had every editor in the business that could look at it. Look at it. It's been proofread to death. It's got the top quality narrator. It's published in all formats. It's published internationally, kind of as close together as I could possibly achieve it. And I wanted to do it properly. But so you're immediately on. I guess my answer is I was immediately on to then thinking,
Yeah. The business
this is
of
all
it.
very
Yeah.
well, but it's the
Time
business
to
now.
market.
I've got to
Yeah.
get it out there. And I didn't honestly didn't know how it was going to be received, because some of the agents we had put it through, they were like, well, this is quite dark. Like people might not like this. I'm not sure people are ready. And this is during the pandemic as well, so I'm not sure people are
Yeah.
ready to read this kind of thing. Or it's not got a traditional antagonist. That was kind of something I had. Like it's not got a bad guy. Books need a bad guy.
I
So,
see. I see.
I'd gone through those things, and that's a lot of doubt to take on in your
Mhm.
mind. You're like, okay, well,
It's
I'll finish
true.
the story, but maybe it's just gonna go nowhere. And my very first NetGalley review, NetGalley, for those of your readers
Mhm.
that don't know, is like an advanced review copy site. You can upload your digital copy to it, and people can request
Mhm.
to read it. And my PR company approved a load of people that got to read the book. And I was going around the Harry Potter studios one day with my family and some people that were visiting from Singapore, incidentally, which has a dictator. Another story for another time. But going around the Harry Potter studios, and in the middle of it, just as they were we got to the bit where there's the Harry Potter train, and got a ping on my thing, and I got my first Netflix review. It had been forwarded on from the PR company,
Oh.
and it wasn't great. It was 3 stars. It was mixed. It was mixed, man. And I
Funny
could
how
tell
that
you,
works.
I'd always told myself it wasn't going to affect me, but damn, it did. Like, damn, it was it was a slap. So I was like, oh yeah, I kind of agree with that. Like, I agree with some of
Oof.
these comments. Like,
Yeah.
and suddenly the whole wind is taken out of you. Like, you're just like, oh wow, like I wrote a book,
Yeah.
but maybe it's a crap book. And I was
Mhm.
saved because and I hadn't told him, but the guy who was visiting, he wasn't a friend of mine. He's like the husband of somebody who's friends with my wife. They'd come over from
Mhm.
Singapore, never met him before. And the day before we'd gone anyway, I'd said, oh, I heard you're writing a book. Can I see a copy of it? And I gave him, a copy of the book just to look at. And he said, look, I'm not a big reader, but I read Harlan Coben, the thriller writer, and, I enjoy his stuff. Do you mind if I just flick? And I was like, yeah, yeah. He didn't. He almost didn't move for like 3 days off the sofa. He literally didn't move. He was so hooked on it. He was so enthusiastic about it. He loved every minute of it. And so, at least in this weekend, I had this counterpart. I had the true author experience. I had somebody that was like meh about the book, and somebody that was like whoa about the book, who
Yeah.
literally sat there going like, "This is one of the best things I've ever read." Like, and I could
Mhm.
see how much he loved it because we just couldn't get him to like move. Like we were like, "Hey, we need to go to Harry Potter now," and he's like,
It's
"Wait,
time
wait,
to
wait, wait,
go to
wait,
Harry Potter.
wait," you know.
Just
Um,
bringing it on the rides with them.
yeah.
No,
So
that's
I think
awesome.
that sums up the whole author's experience. You're going to have people that love it, some people that hate it, some people that are meh, and you just got to find enough people that love it because those are who you're
Mhm.
writing for.
Yeah, I feel like so much of it is, obviously the quality of writing is going to matter at the end of the day, but there's this whole other portion of it that's really just finding the right audience. Like, and my little corner of the world, which is relatively small, especially compared to, Smitty, Kristen, and Maddie, two great book talkers who have a very large audience. It's like my corner of the world is relatively small compared to theirs. Their corner of the world is relatively small compared to the greater readership out there, but like we love the book and it's phenomenal. And just the fact that it made it way all the way to us here, and like me, Smitty, Christian, and Maddie are scattered across the US, but the fact that the book made it here into our hands and we're obsessed with it and we love it. And then there's, Joe Schmo with a 3-star review on NetGalley. Like it's just how it goes. But
Yeah, it
I did
is.
want to extrapolate about like the feedback you've received from like general audience. What were you most concerned about when getting that feedback, and kind of what have you experienced so far?
I've experienced a lot of incredibly positive feedback, and
Mhm.
sometimes you kind of almost shake yourself and you can't believe people are writing such amazing things about your book. I mean, I remember one earlier reviewer saying like this was a successor to 1984, and like this was like this
Wow.
generation's 1984, and he's like, wow. In fact, two people in the same week said the same thing, and I promise I didn't pay them. Like straight, like um, and that's awesome. But as I say, you're still reading people that were like, I guessed the twist. And you're like, did you really? Well, at least they guessed some of the twist,
Mm.
or uh, it the pacing. People pacing. I think is really individual. So some people find
So
it really quick.
subjective.
Some people find that it starts slow and then picks up pace and then goes really fast towards the end. Some people find it slumps in the middle because it shifts into more of the murder mystery stuff. Some people find the ending too rushed. Um, so you hear it all, and there's not much you can
Yeah.
do with that because unless everybody is saying the same thing, you realize, well, it's all subjective. So I
Hmm.
can't, when I come to write my next book, necessarily go, well, fix that. Although I do think, and uh, I was aiming really for that kind of feeling of getting faster and faster and faster and faster and faster
Hmm.
towards the end. And I
Yeah,
do
that
think
ramp
that
up.
I probably just needed maybe an extra few chapters
Mm.
just to balance. But so what I was really trying to do was, so I've mentioned this in a TikTok the other day, but two of my favorite movies with twists are The Usual Suspects and Memento, and both of them
Mm.
pretty much have the twist in the last seconds of the
Oh
entire
wow.
movie, and that was something I that stayed with me so strongly. I was trying to achieve that,
Hmm.
and when you're pushing that realization, it wasn't really in the last bit, but really in that
Yeah,
last
right there in that.
section of the book, that you're trying to go, well, all of these breadcrumbs now come together, and bam, inevitably people are going to go, well, hold on a second, like that's a massive, massive thing, but I need to know more. Like, where's the rest of the detail?
Yeah.
Um, sorry, like
Yeah, I
I did my
definitely
best.
had
It
the
was my
effect
first
of
book.
like definitely had the effect of wanting more for sure. I was like, okay, now that I know this, I have to know so much more.
Well, that's the thing.
Um,
The nature of this kind of twist is actually one that opens up things rather than necessarily closes it down.
mhm,
Um,
absolutely.
that's something I would like to have done differently. I'd like to have a book that was very, very, I really felt like it answered everything. But I just felt this is about this was about telling the story that provided most impact. And we were debating this a bit on Chris and Maddie's live session
Mhm,
yesterday, because they were like, look, or at least I think Maddie was saying, hey, it worked for me. If you never write another book, like on this topic, I still think it's incredible, and I didn't need any more. And if you write any more, great. Whereas Kristen was like, no, no, I need to see like what happens next. And I guess that's always going to be the case when things are ambiguous. Inception for me was a movie that left you wondering, but that was part of the glory of it. Nobody really wanted an Inception 2 to come along and answer that. But I like that kind of feeling of ambiguity. But I do think if the reception to this continues to build, if enough people love this book, I do have a plan to write a second one. I've had a plan that's been developing slowly over the last few years. I've been drip feeding it. I've got stuff written. I have early scenes. I know what the
mhm.
ending was going to be. Um, I
I
didn't
love
write it
that.
as my second book because my editor, who, as I say, is brilliant, basically said, "Look, before this first one is published, you should start writing your second one, because if it goes badly, at least you won't give up. At least you've started to write your second one.
Mhm.
And if it turns out people hate the first one, then write something that is not the sequel, because you don't
It's
know
true.
what the reception is going to be." And so
Yeah, you'd hate to be there.
so I wrote a different book, and that's what I'm trying to finish now. And
That's
it's
exciting.
in the same. It's like it still fits my brand. I think. I hope it's a different book to Artificial Wisdom. It's got its own big stuff that it's trying to deal with. It's got twists and turns. It's got an interesting world. It's got cool characters. It's got all the bits that I hope I've achieved. But it's a fundamentally different story, and it's a bit more of an action thriller mystery. Um,
Ooh,
but it's got a sci-fi setting, like a really
I
cool
see.
sci-fi
I
setting.
see. I imagine it doesn't have a title yet, or is it a title we're hiding for now?
It does. I'm happy to say, because I can't keep my mouth shut about these things, but it has a title and a cover. It's going to be called Futility Town.
That is so sick. Wow.
This is the Alpha Reader special edition that I put together for 15 people out of my Alpha Readers. So I get it nicely printed up. And the reception was great. Like, people really enjoyed it. My wife actually prefers it to Artificial Wisdom. She wants
Hmm.
the sequel to this one before I write the sequel to Artificial Wisdom. That's going to be something to negotiate, but
Yeah,
she really, really likes it. I'm not happy with it yet. Like, I got all the
I
feedback
see.
in, and everybody was like, "This is great," and I'm like, "No, it's no, and now
That's how
I'm
it
tearing
goes.
it to bits, and I just have paper everywhere right now, because
Mhm.
I'm this is like how I do plotting. I do plotting on big pieces of paper,
Oh,
probably
wow.
upside down, and
It's
I'm
all
like
over the
drawing stuff
place.
out, and I'm like, okay, what do I want people to believe when, and who's the bad guy where, and like what's all the different threads of stuff, and how does it all fit together, and what are all the puzzle pieces, and who are all the antagonists, and how do I link them? And I've gone from a story that actually made sense when you read it from beginning to ending, and right now it's all broken and in bits and doesn't make sense anymore, and it's not a holistic narrative. And I
Mm.
have to piece it all back together again and make sense of it.
I'm sure it'll come together. I definitely believe in your ability to do so. I think the second to last question I'll have is just, you're writing another book, you've possibly got a sequel, you've got your family at home, and it sounds like your ex co founder is also dragging you back into the tech space. What's it been like trying to balance all of those pieces in your life right now?
Yeah, it's complicated at times. I mean, I'm glad I don't have like a. I'm super 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 lucky. Like I don't have a day job anymore. Like
Hmm.
that's such a privilege, and I'll never take that for granted. And I'm like I count a lot of it to luck as much as talent. Like we were lucky
Yeah.
to sell when we did, and to do as well as we did. Um, I get to choose what I do with my time every day. That's interesting. Um, my priorities fluctuate. Sometimes it's very much about my health and well-being.
Hmm.
Um, I was doing really well in the gym until I basically uh, suffered suffered a massive setback and had to take 6 months off. I'm struggling to
Oh,
get
I
going with it
see.
again. I had to have an operation and everything. It was awful,
Hmm.
but like so I try and keep myself healthy. I try and go to the gym a
Hmm.
lot. I try and go to the spa and take walks and look after my
Hmm.
own mental health. Um, I find if I don't write first thing in the morning, it doesn't happen because it requires a very different kind of cognitive space.
Hmm.
Like you need to be in a different type of flow. And if I start almost anything else before I start writing, I never get to the writing.
Oh, I
But I also
see.
find that
Interesting.
actually part of what makes the writing work and flow is if I've done the thinking first.
Mm.
And so sometimes taking a walk or doing a run or something is will actually help me shape what I end up writing. And then my co-founder is in LA, so he doesn't come online until like 4 or 5 p.m.
Okay.
And so like often I'll be doing kind of tech stuff in the mid afternoons or publishing stuff or both. And then he'll come online and we'll be working together, and then I'll cook for everybody, and then we'll be doing stuff in the evening. And now because things are picking up, particularly in the US with the publishing, like a lot of the people I'm chatting to over TikTok are online very late my time. Um, so I kind of went from doing a load of art and messing around and doing nothing to kind of managing like three or four things all at the same time. It's
Oh, I
completely
see.
crazy. Fortunately, my wife is also building her own business at the same time, so
Oh, wow.
we're able to
Is it
support
also
each
tech
other.
related or
It's partially
in
tech related. She's building a platform for women who it's like a coaching platform. So she's
wow.
she's looking at how do you scale kind of coaching, but also
Mhm.
like coaching for professional women. Like it's such an interesting kind of place. So her
Yeah.
business is awesome. It's really taking off. Ida, she's called it AIDA, but it's great. We're both doing on things at the same time, and it's going incredibly well for her. And she's I look at her with a lot of respect because she's actually changing people's lives. Like when she comes down and
Mhm.
she's like, "Oh yeah, we just had this group call with like 5 people, and and these are some of the things they said," and I'm like, "Wow, you are actually changing people's lives profoundly." I'm just writing about people's lives, I tell a nice story, I get to walk away. You're like they are ending up on a different career path as a
Mhm.
result of some of the things that you were talking about. So
That's awesome. I'm happy to hear it. But yeah, it sounds like you've got a pretty good balance going, but I can definitely see where there'd be challenges with, and I have a feeling that things are going to get even busier for you as this book starts to spread because it is phenomenal. The last question I really have for you is, you've mentioned that you've got your co-founder, you guys are working on a new technology. Last question, very simple. Is the new tech the newer reality technology we saw in the book? And is that on the way?
well, so everything in the book is on its way in some shape or form. I
Wow.
did not want to write, even though it is one of my favorite movies of all time, I did not want to write another Back to the Future 2, where you
Mm.
get to the year in question and you're like, where's my hoverboard, man? Like, where's my flying car? Um, I didn't want to write another one of those things. And it's tricky with technology and sci fi
Yeah.
because there's a relationship. Often sci-fi informs technology, like Star Trek, like created like the mobile phone. Ender's Game had like a tablet in it way before
Mhm.
there was a tablet. Snow Crash basically kind of invented. Was it Snow Crash or the other one? neuromancer that invented the internet. One of these two were like seminal in
Mm.
shaping our view of one the internet and the other one virtual reality. Um, so I think sci-fi plays a part in technology, but then you extrapolate from technology to sci-fi. And
Mm.
one of the things that was important to me was I can see this world now where physical screens are starting to disappear because we're able to project things in the eye which are incredible. And I've been watching this for a number of years. So
Wow.
why does every sci-fi out there set thousands of years in the future rely on screens, right? It makes no sense to
How
me.
bizarre.
Like,
Yeah.
you have terminals everywhere, but like we've got the tech now to project into our eyes. So yes, it's not perfect yet. Yes, Apple have released clunky stuff and it's heavy and it causes a headache. But actually, if you've tried the Apple Reality Pro, I don't know if you have, but like some of the bits of it are mind blowing. Like especially for me, the spatial videos where it's like looking
Mm.
at the window and seeing reality on the other side of that window, and it's the pre-recorded video. Like I want
Yeah.
to capture my parents, and my kids and stuff, and have them to experience in the future in that way. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So anyway, like long story short, I see things like neuroreality, which to me is a um, brain tapped version of virtual reality.
Mm.
It is a way of linking a full sensory environment in, instead of just seeing stuff coming in through your eyes, and instead of hearing stuff going in through your ears, we've gone directly into the source of all of these things.
Yeah.
And of course, we have the beginnings of brain computer interfaces today. Facebook,
Mm.
Meta have done some incredible research that's able to read stuff out. And, you've got Elon Musk with Neuralink working on brain chips. I'm sure I want to
Mm.
be one of those first patients, but there you go. Like it's happened. Like
Yeah. I think I'll wait till 2050
yeah,
before I give
I'm
those a
with you on
try.
that one. But there's a lot of stuff happening in this regard. Like
Yeah.
we're starting to experience these things, and I was very inspired by neuroscientists like David Eagleman, like his story on the brain a few years ago, which really talked about how the brain is amazing at putting stuff together. And
Mm.
to the point where it is literally just receiving electrical signals and it's cut off from the world in its own little cave. Yet it's able to take these electrical inputs and turn them into reality.
Yeah.
And if one of those electrical inputs gets cut in some way, if you go blind, if you go deaf, if you lose whatever, um, the other ones will adjust. But you can also introduce new senses. Like you could give the ability to experience something as touch and reinterpret it as sight. Like the brain is just
Wow.
malleable in a way that's just unbelievable. So I guess the long story short is yes, I think maybe it will be possible. I don't know on what timeline, but things are moving fast right now, and things are moving fast because all of these different strands are coming together. And AI, I can tell you now, creating a startup like AI, our ability to code with just me and my co-founder, we're
Hmm.
coding at maybe 30, 40 times the speed that we were when we did our first startup back in
Wow.
2012. And we're doing it with the two of us instead of a team of 6 or 7 people. And
Mm.
like an AI is able to is playing a role in it because it's brilliant at coding. And once we get to the stage where AI is able to look at the holistic code base and
Hmm.
improve it very, very quickly and iterate on stuff, like technology creation is going to go through the roof. We're going to see inventions come along that we just can't imagine today because we're going to crack some of the very fundamental problems that are currently limiting us. So I just
Absolutely.
think we're in exponential times. This is why the book for me, it makes some advances, but I think 2050 is realistic. And I had a proofreader
Feels
right at
very
the end
realistic.
who was like, "This all sounds like climate and tech. It sounds like it should be 2070." I'm like, "Nope." On
No, I
both of
mean, if
those
we take a
fronts,
look between even just now and 2000, like the amount of technology we've been able to advance and the speed at which,
unbelievable.
yeah, in
Yeah,
between, 75 and 2000, like it's just going to keep going in that direction. And so
that's
I
right.
think the book does a great job there.
Yeah, I could talk for hours about this, but essentially, technology. They have what are called S curves, right? Which is
Hmm.
adoption curves, and the S curves are getting quicker and quicker and quicker. But if you look at something like the mobile phone, I think the smartphone is a great example because we're less. What is it? 20? We're less than 20 years since it was created. I need to look it
Hmm.
up now, but I'm trying to remember, but we're not that far out. and it has transformed everything about how we interface with people around the world. And so, in the lifespan of the book, we're talking 30 years into the future. So you had to take stuff which you could see coming along today, but was going to go through faster S curves, and then might go one version beyond that as well. Right?
Hmm.
That's kind of the way that I thought about the tech evolution.
Wow.
But
It's
it is all
yeah,
new.
this
Like it's all new,
yeah.
even in the book. Like so, Tully's not used to some of these things. Like at the
Hmm.
beginning, like he
Didn't have the
throws
full
his
version of it yet.
yeah, he's not used to it. There's mistakes are made.
Yeah, it's such a I just think overall this book is so well put together and so well informed with not only the information it has about our world right now, but what we can realistically project into the future and either have hope for or have concerns for. So just bravo once again on an incredible piece of work here. If anybody who's listening hasn't read it yet, I highly recommend you go grab it as soon as possible because you do not want to miss out on this wonderful novel. Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you.
Wishing you the best of luck with the rest of the rollout for this one. Wishing you the best of luck with either the sequel or the next book that you're working on. So excited. I'm
Will
going
do,
to be
buddy.
locked in on whatever else you make for here on out. And yeah, thank you guys so much. And we'll be talking soon.